You mentioned the Battle of Smolensk and Kyiv. Why were these battles so pivotal?
Smolensk was harder than the Germans anticipated. The casualty rates are staggering, tens of thousands on each side in every major operation. And so they did lose a lot. Smolensk was another area where there was a huge encirclement by the Germans of the Red Army forces. After Smolensk, it's on the road. It's famously the same route Napoleon took to Moscow. At that point, the drive toward Moscow paused and the armored forces went north and south. Kyiv was very important strategically and psychologically. It was the Soviet Union's third city, I guess, capital of Ukraine, a major transportation hub, a manufacturing hub. And it just also, again, the biggest encirclement and capture of POWs in the war, close to 700,000 people captured. And that was a not only strategic and military blow, but also a great psychological blow to the Soviets, to the Soviet people.
Why did Moscow almost become a secondary objective? If the Nazis captured Moscow, would have this changed kind of the, the outcome of Barbarossa? Would it led to the Soviet defeat?
There's again a lot of debate, and thinking has changed. When I was in school, Moscow was, and if you look at a map, especially the road or rail maps of Russia, you'll see that Moscow is the hub for everything. So, and it was a key manufacturing area. That's, where they made weapons and tanks and rail cars and all sorts of things. So there's that. It was the political and still is the political center. Is that, I remember reading something like this a long time ago. Even if the Germans reached Moscow, there's a lot of Russia. The Nazis' actual goal, their long-term goal, what they envisioned taking was up what they called all of Europe. And to them, the border between Europe and Asia was the Volga River. So there was a line they drew from Archangel down, sort of skirting the Urals, but then hit the Volga River. So anything beyond that, they figured was Asia. Common thinking now is the border is the Ural River, the Ural Mountains, the Ural River. It's arbitrary no matter who's looking at it. It's one landmass. That was the long-term goal. They did reach the Volga, took them longer than they thought. Taking Moscow, would it have made a difference to Napoleon?
It didn't win, did he? So eventually.
Eventually. So it's, what would have happened? We'll never know what would have happened because there's just no way to test it. But I kind of think even if the Germans had reached Moscow, they couldn't have won. And this is the thinking among most of the historians that I'm reading now, from James Holland to David Stahl to Anthony Tucker Jones, everybody is, there was no way Germany could win, right? I just spoke with Craig Luther. Germany at the time had a population of around 80 million, and the Soviet Union had a population of 140 million. So there's just the question of resources. Germany's entire strategy from the beginning was, blitzkrieg. We're going to be hit hard. If we don't do it fast, and this is what all the generals knew, if they don't win by summer 1941, we've lost.
Didn't Stalin have a lot of his resources pushed further away from Moscow as well?
Yes.
So if they captured Moscow, they still would have had a lot of resources they could use to counterattack the Nazis once they captured it.
That's another part of it, is that Stalin made a lot of mistakes. They both made a lot of mistakes, especially at the beginning of the war. The smartest thing he did was on the 22nd, ordered all the factories that existed west of Moscow to be disassembled, shipped east into the, closer to the Urals or beyond the Urals, out of range of German bombers. And the Germans never did develop a heavy long-range bomber. So it meant that they didn't have production at all for a year, close to it. But when the factories did come online by 1942, late 1942, and especially by 1943, they were cranking out, and they were using mass production techniques, learned from the Americans. Numbers, especially from the Soviet Union, are hard to come by and not reliable. So they did make 60 to 80,000 of the T-34 series of medium tanks. Some called it the best tank of the war, probably the most effective, depends how you measure it, but it certainly made a big difference. And just think 80,000 of anything. And their production, and some historians have called this the war production, that's what made the big difference, is while Soviet production of war materiel was increasing greatly, German production was decreasing. They did turn out more tanks, develop some, the Tiger and the Panther, but they could never match the numbers. And by 1944, within 1944, they weren't producing enough anything to replace what they were losing, especially on the Eastern Front.
Isn't that similar to the Battle of Britain, where the British started off with not enough planes, but then their rate of production became quicker than the Luftwaffe's, and that eventually helped them win that battle?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with those statistics there, but yeah, it always did astound me that the British were able to produce not only like more and more Spitfires and Mosquitoes, but also that they kept innovating and they were bringing out new models, new models of Spitfires and heavy bombers and medium bombers, and just the array of different kinds of airplanes that really surprised me.
How come Germany couldn't keep up with the Soviets' production when they were taking so much land from them?
The Germans didn't use the same mass production techniques that the Americans and Russians did. It was more of a, I think this is overstating it a bit, but it was more of a artisanal approach to it. So they had smaller, more scattered factories, so they weren't achieving the same scale. They also tended to use, one part of the thinking was, we're going to take the Skoda works, the manufacturing centers in the Czech or Czechoslovakia had been broken up in Yugoslavia. They took a lot of captured French tanks and Czech tanks or Czech vehicles and so on. But the problem with that is every single one of them was different, manufactured to different standards, different engineering approaches, which meant they each had a different maintenance protocol. They took different spare parts. So getting the right parts to the battlefield where they were needed was a constant chore or a challenge. Another thing that they always faced was a fuel shortage. They never had enough fuel. So as the panzers are racing across the steppes in Ukraine, for example, kept having to stop first to let the infantry catch up, but also because they're running out of fuel. By the time Stalingrad, the Battle of Stalingrad was happening, they had to curtail flights because they didn't have enough aviation fuel. Their main source of oil was Romania, the famous Ploiești airfields. Part of the drive behind Operation Blue, which ended at the Battle of Stalingrad, was to get the oil fields of the Caucasus. And that didn't work out because by the time the Germans did get there, the Soviets had set them on fire. So, and then they ended up not actually holding the area for very long, had to retreat from the Caucasus as well. So that whole oil drive was a bust.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Nazis get within 19 miles of Moscow. Because 19, yeah. Yeah. 19, which is crazy to think about. How come they ended up failing Operation Typhoon despite getting that close?